Today we're going to be looking at my favourite watches worn by each actor to play the world's greatest secret agent.
Danger Zone.
No, not that one. I'm talking, of course, about James Bond, aka 007. Now, listen closely, 007 fans. This list is made up of the 6 actors to officially portray the British spy. So, unfortunately, no David Niven today, or the bloke from the TV show whose name I can never remember. Sean Connery. The OG Bond, Sean Connery, wears a few different watches throughout his tenure, including a Breitling Top Time with a Geiger counter and a Gruen 510 Precision. But his most well-known watch is perhaps my favourite watch as well, and potentially my favourite Bond watch of all time, or at least one of my favourite Bond watches of all time, and that is the Rolex Submariner Reference 6538. Both on a metal bracelet and a slightly downsized NATO strap. It would later become known as the Bond NATO and then later the Connery Bond NATO strap as well. This watch is almost impossible to find nowadays. However, I did recently find one listing on Sotheby's, the guide price for which was 180 to 280,000 US dollars. And to think, recently I reviewed a Casio for £30. George Lazenby. Aussie model turned actor George Lazenby is up next, and despite only starring in one film on Her Majesty's Secret Service, Lazenby wears 2 watches during the film in the form of a Rolex Submariner Reference 5513 and the Rolex chronograph, also known as the Pre-Daytona Reference 6238. Now I have to say, out of the two, the Pre-Daytona is my favourite. I've seen similar but not identical watches of this one go for between 40 to 60,000 US dollars online. Side note, actually, George Lazenby actually lied about his acting credentials and blagged his way into an audition, where he eventually got the part as well, so that's very 007, if you ask me. Roger Moore. In my opinion, the cheesiest and the funniest Bond, Roger Moore, is up next. He took the mantle of 007 during a somewhat tumultuous time in the watch industry. See my previous video on the Quartz Crisis if you want to know more about that. He gets through roughly 11 watches during his run, including numerous Seikos to a Hamilton Pulsar and, of course, you guessed it, a few Rolexes. Now, despite me wanting to be desperately contrarian and choose a Seiko or a Hamilton Pulsar, the fact of the matter is that I love the Rolex GMT Master Reference 1675 that he wears in The Spy Who Loved Me. Today, this watch is valued between 28 and 35,000 US dollars. Now, can we just appreciate just how bad this is? Timothy Dalton. Dalton's Bond was somewhat more serious than previous Bonds, and many think he was, in fact, the truest representation of Bond the way that Fleming wrote it. His 2 films, The Living Daylights and Licence to Kill, have gone through a bit of a re-evaluation in recent years, and I would definitely recommend having a rewatch when you get the time. But films aside, this really isn't the channel for that. He wears 2 brilliant watches. Firstly, a Tag Heuer Night Diver in PVD black with a luminous dial. And finally, you guessed it again, a Rolex Submariner Reference 5513, the same type that Moore wore in some of his previous films as well. My head says to pick the subby, but my heart says to go affordable in this instance, and for less than $2,000, you can pick up a Tag Heuer Night Diver, and the interesting looks is really the reason why it has my pick. Pierce Brosnan. Some of his films were naff, but GoldenEye is one of the best Bond films of all time, and I absolutely love Brosnan. He was the incumbent Bond when I was growing up, and so I have watched his films in cinema, on TV, and I've also played on the Nintendo 64 games and the PlayStation games as well. Now, the Omega Seamaster Professional 300 was the watch on his wrist throughout his run as Bond. That started a relationship between the two brands that has spanned from 1995 all the way to today. First starting out as a quartz model and then upgrading to an automatic towards the end of his increasingly bad Bond films, this watch is perhaps my second favourite Omega in the series, and you can find these models regularly now for between $1,500 to $4,000, dependent on movement and the condition as well. Daniel Craig. Finally, we have Daniel Craig's modern Bond, and generally speaking, I don't mind him at all. Casino Royale and Skyfall offer some of the best films in the series, but none of his films are particularly bad in any way, which I think says a lot. Craig and the production share their relationship with Omega, and throughout the series we see Seamasters, Planet Oceans, and even Aquaterras. His latest film, No Time to Die, has a Seamaster in stunning titanium, which does look amazing. But my favourite has to be the Seamaster from Spectre, which is more in line with its heritage line. Now, this model is discontinued, but you can find an almost identical version of this watch with a normal bezel insert instead, and either a leather or steel band for between 5,000 to 7,000 US dollars. Now, those are my choices for each Bond actor who played James Bond and their collections. So, out of all of them, I'd probably say that I would pick either Roger Moore or Daniel Craig as my favourite run of watches worn by a Bond actor. Moore's because of the variety on offer. You've got the Rolex Submariner, the Rolex GMT, you've got Seikos and you've got Hamiltons all mixed together, which I think is a really interesting combination, would make for a great collection. And Craig's because, well, technically speaking, his watches offer the best technology, and with the coaxial movement and other materials, it's just something really interesting that he's got. Yes, it's all the same brand, but Omega is a great brand nonetheless. But what do you guys think? Let me know your choices below. Should I do a list of Bond watches with gadgets next, or should I do my favourite Bond watches overall? Let me know again in the comments below. If you found value in this video, why not consider subscribing to the channel? And if you want to see more of this type of video, please leave it a like so I know what to do next. Stay safe everyone, and I'll see you all in a future video.
Like a martini, shaken, not stirred. I want it now. Don't make me wait.
Do 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 do. That was pretty good.